Welcome to OTD Military History. Today we're going to be doing a reaction video to a recent video put out by Simple History. And very much in the vein of their work, it is titled, very simply, Why Do Canadians Go Ballistic During War? This video is part of kind of an overall theme of kind of in a meme-like style of Canadians being very different once they go to war. You know, playing into stereotypes of Canadians, us Canadians being nice people all the time, and once there's conflict, it's very different. So I see this quite a bit as a public Canadian military historian. So we'll get into it and see what they have to say.
Why do Canadians go ballistic in war? Canadians. We all know the stereotype.
This is all we all live, by the way.
Friendly and extremely apologetic. If
Watching
you're
your
fighting them, though, avoid them at all costs, because for some strange reason, these usually calm maple leaf lovers go absolutely ballistic when there's a war on.
It is a good tree.
Trench raids. In World War I, the only thing scarier than going on a trench raid was to be on the receiving end of a Canadian one. Soon after their deployment, the Canucks earned a fearsome reputation.
I like the guy carrying appears to be a cleaver there in the middle, which is interesting.
As enthusiastic and innovative practitioners.
And looks like a war club of some sort.
Practitioners of this brutal art. To maximize
Cleavers and
stealth,
war
they
club.
were known to blacken their faces and to wear thick rubber gloves. They also brought along with them a variety of handmade weapons to optimize their killing effectiveness, such as spiked clubs, knives, and brass knuckles to allow them to take out enemies silently. Alternatively, pipe bombs and grenade catapults were used if they preferred to go in guns blazing.
So the Canadians weren't the only ones to do that period. Trench raiding was, both sides did it. Also the use of things like pipe bombs, which were earlier in the war used kind of at a necessity because the technology and everything hadn't caught up again with the siege warfare that had developed on the Western Front. So they were building things that they needed to kind of work to try and clear enemy out of the trenches. So that's kind of an older thing. They didn't really need to make pipe bombs, especially into 1917, 1918. They had plenty of Mills bombs, grenades by the end, and also improvisation with clubs and trench weapons and all that stuff was also used by both sides. So this isn't a uniquely Canadian thing. Hear that a lot, that the Canadians did this. They were particularly brutal with it. Or that they invented it, which none of that is necessarily true. I mean, yes, trench raids are brutal no matter what's going on or who's doing them. It's not exactly fun to be part of it or on the receiving end of one. So also the Canadians did not invent it. Origins are disputed, but pretty sure based on research of others and a lot of others, the Canadians did not invent trench raiding. But did they carry out a lot of them? Definitely.
On operation, the Canadians tore through trenches so quickly and with such cold-blooded efficiency that by the end of the war, they were able to reach up to 1 kilometer behind.
They were very
lines.
successful in that.
Their speed and ferocity earned them the nicknames from the terrified Germans, ranging from stormtroopers to wild colonials. The savage determination of the Canadians was most on show in the 4 months leading up to the Battle of Vimy Ridge, where they conducted 55 raids.
Yep. There's a lot.
The most disastrous of these happened in March of 1917, involving over 1,300 soldiers, despite suffering an appalling 43% casualty rate and being constantly gassed. One group of raiders was able to clear a 450-meter section of the German trench.
So just on that gas in that raid that took place in March 1917, it was their own gas. That was the problem. The wind had shifted and hit them with their own stuff, making it more difficult to carry it out. And actually, they took a high number of casualties as part of that. And they suffered as a result when the attack went ahead in April 1917. Because of that raid, it was very hard to recover from that. So now we're going to be getting into also what is one of the most controversial parts of Canada's involvement in both world wars in a lot of ways.
Killing prisoners of war. When they weren't going on deadly nighttime raids, the Canadians could usually be found slaughtering prisoners of war. Shockingly, in World War I, the murder of German POWs was actively encouraged by some commanders.
But yeah, in some
Before
cases,
the attack on Vimy Ridge, for instance, one soldier recalled how an officer told him, Remember, no prisoners. They'll just eat your
Good
rations.
math.
Having to share already limited food supplies was just one of the reasons why most preferred to shoot rather than capture.
I mean, kind of. That's not really the case. It's not like rations were limited in terms of them getting to the front lines. It was getting them to those front trenches or those on the attack. Conditions made that difficult. So it wasn't like they were starving all the time. Yeah, you're not getting as much food as you may want, but they're getting supplied. So it makes it sound like they're not getting supplied. So it's already limited to begin with. No, it'll be there on the attack of why it's limited. So yes, I guess you could say that that's what's going on, but I don't really see that as much of a justification in really the letters or anything I've done digging on this. But of course it did happen. Both sides killed POWs throughout the entirety of the war. That never changed.
But the most powerful justifications were revenge and battle rage. In a typical account, one lieutenant would recall how, after losing half of his company to machine gun fire, his surviving men rushed to the battery that had caused the damage to find the Germans inside crying and with their hands up.
They weren't the only ones.
They proceeded to mercilessly bludgeon and shoot them to death. Another would relate on one occasion, a German rushed to one of his comrades with a bayonet, but then chickened out and surrendered. In his own words, "Our boy would have none of it. He lunged at the German again and again, who each time lowered his arms and struck the point of the bayonet with his bare hands. The German was screaming for mercy." Even if a surrendering German somehow survived his initial encounter with a wild colonial, his life was still in great danger.
Not really.
In this regard, one veteran will remember how he once witnessed one of his fellow Canadians turn a German POW into red mist by dropping a live grenade into his greatcoat pocket.
So I've heard that story as well. I'm not sure exactly who it comes from, but I've heard that story, which is interesting that someone drops a grenade in someone's pocket and is able to get away in time before it also blows them up. I'm not really sure how that would work exactly. I'm not saying that this didn't happen, but it just the logistics of that are something I question. But the idea that they're killing POWs well behind the lines is not true. You hear this again about Canada in the Second World War as well. There's no proof of this. There's no evidence of this well behind the lines. It just doesn't happen. Canadians take thousands of POWs in both wars. Many survive and go on to POW camps. Some emigrate to Canada after the Second World War, so it couldn't have been all that bad how they're treated. And this section is very interesting about the live and let die stuff.
Live and let die. During World War I, soldiers carried out an unofficial live and let live policy. Really. This was an unspoken agreement in which both sides agreed to only attack each other if ordered. The most famous example of this in action was the unofficial 1914 Christmas Day truce, in which thousands of combatants from both sides exchanged gifts, sang carols, and mingled with each other for a few hours. The next year, though, the Canucks were on the front lines, and unlike their allies, live and let live was not in their vocabulary. Among their number were the troops of the 3rd Battalion, who were stationed in the salient on the Western Front. In the spirit of the previous year, voices from the opposing trench wished them a happy Christmas, and some of the friendlier Canucks returned the greetings. After a couple of minutes, men from both sides had raised their heads above the dugouts, and an older, whiskered man was invitingly waving a box of cigars. Moments later, a Canadian sergeant ruined Christmas by dispatching 2 Germans with his machine gun. Of course, this wouldn't be the last time the
So this is an interesting one because I found the War Diary, which if those aren't familiar, War Diary is a recollection, a recording of events of every day that the unit's involved in the fighting. And I found the 3rd Battalion War Diary for Christmas 1915. And it's quite an interesting read. I can share it here. So as can be seen here, this is the entry for Christmas, as you can see, in the trenches in the salient. So read it real quick here. Germans attempted to make friends, but gave up after several of them were shot. Corporal Nash B Company and Private Keon A Company, both shot through the head and killed. Quiet day. HQ moved to RE Farm at night. Weather fair. So that's interesting because it confirms what the video is saying. We have evidential proof of that, which is interesting. But also the Germans are returning fire. It's not just the Canadians who are the ones doing the fighting. Is it after the fact? I don't know. It doesn't say. But it's not like the Germans just took that laying down. What is also interesting about this Christmas truce, not every unit does it in 1914. The High Command is not happy about such a thing. I think for obvious reasons, you don't want your enemy, being, don't want to fraternize with the enemy. It makes it harder to fight them. So lots of orders come down as don't ever do that again. It never really does happen again. Both sides don't really do it. 1915. So to kind of single out the Canadians, saying there are these bloodthirsty troops for doing such a thing. Yes, there's evidence, obviously, that this is what happens, but it is also war. So to expect, one day everything's just going to stop, it's a bit naive, I feel, on the Germans. And so is this next part that we'll see about them and this sort of live and let live system that, again, was not always as pervasive as this video makes it sound.
False sense of security by their heartless North American foe. In one particularly cruel episode, Canuck troops tossed tins of corned beef into a German trench. Then, when they heard their requests for more, they lobbed grenades at them instead. Has the story so far?
So yes, that is also documented and happened, but I think it's a bit naive on the Germans to expect anything other than that in a war, right? Yes, the blockade, Germany is causing issues with food, so of course they're going to want that, any food they can get. But to expect your enemy all of a sudden to be feeding you, and it's all going to just be okay, to me is extremely naive. And to say that the Canadians are any more bloodthirsty than anybody else in this case, I think really misses the point, because all kinds of nasty tricks are pulled in warfare, right? Pretending to be the other side for calling out for a medic or a corpsman or something like that. Happened all the time. So to say like this is some sort of nasty trick only the Canadians were pulling is just, again, not the case.
Illustrated. For some reason, Canadians went absolutely bananas in World War I. But why were they so angry?
Quite brutal in some cases.
Some historians have argued their ruthlessness was an emotional response to a battlefield rumor about the so-called crucified Canadian, an officer who was supposedly crucified to a barn door near Ypres. Others have.
So it's interesting they're bringing up the crucified Canadian. Again, a very controversial part of the war. There's no proof that such an event ever happened. An actual Canadian government investigation was carried out. And any soldier that they got to had always heard secondhand about this event. None had actually seen it themselves. They always had heard it from somebody else. And I think a case in point here is very interesting how it's presented. It's said to be an officer here in this video. I've always heard it was a sergeant. Also, it was heard that was one of the Highland battalions. Clearly, that soldier was in pants, and they were not wearing pants in the First World War for the Canadian Highland units. So, again, the details are very sketchy of what it was, and it was nothing more than a rumor. There was never any proof that such a thing took place. However, this gassing did happen.
Speculated their thirst for revenge drew from their traumatic experience at the harrowing 1915 Second Battle of Ypres, during which Canadians took the brunt of the first ever German poison gas attack of the war. The best explanation, however, may be the simple fact that Canadians were brutalized more than any others because they were always being placed in the first wave of attacks. Juno Beach. By the close.
So they kind of summarize that the Canadians were always cutting at the forefront. And that's why they're so brutalized. I mean, kind of. They're at the forefront towards the end of the war, particularly the 100 days. They are the spear point. That's undeniable. But that's not really the case early on, right? They're not even part of, like, say, the big ones. The first day of the Somme, they're not there. The Newfoundlanders are there, but not any Canadian units at the time. Same with the Third Ypres, or what's commonly known as Passchendaele. They're not there at the beginning either. They have other battles they're fighting on their own as a corps. So, again, it kind of misses a point a little bit and kind of fudges the truth a bit. But, the brutality of the Canadian Corps in the First World War is more noted than it is, say, in the Second, or better documented, that's for sure.
Of the Great War, Canadians had gone from a relatively unknown fighting force to one of the planet's most feared and respected military outfits. It was with this hard-earned reputation that they would enter the killing fields of World War II to face off against a German army reinforced by elite units with a strangely familiar name, Stormtroopers.
So I have an issue there, because these are clearly troops of the SS. and a lot of you who follow my channel know I don't believe the SS were elite fighters, particularly the SS the Canadians faced early in Normandy, the 12th SS. I don't see how there's any evidence to present them as elite. Yeah, sure, they got some fancy kit in some cases, but to say that they're elite is just incorrect. They were never able to push the Canadians back to the beaches. They never really won any battles against the Canadians, so they just be able to hold them off for an extended period of time, even though that was Allied strategy. But that's neither here nor there. But I just don't like it when it's just thrown out that they're elite and it's never challenged.
On June 6, 1944, the Canadians reminded everyone of their elite status when they pulled off what's considered one of the most tactically successful operations of D-Day. Their objective was to storm Juno Beach and then seize the cities of Caen and Bayeux with 14,000 soldiers and 1,000.
So this one's interesting. I don't know if it's just me hearing it incorrectly or it's the script is presenting it oddly, but they were not ever given the objective on D-Day of taking Bayeux. It's not even close to what they're trying to do. It's an Allied objective. It's not a Canadian objective. And no Canadian unit is given the objective of taking Caen. Their objective is to get to Carpiquet, which you can see right here, which is the airport of Caen of the time and still today, outside of Caen, but they're never given the actual objective of Caen. And that's when I hear a big myth that the Canadians were part of that failure to take Caen. Was never their objective. They were supposed to get to the areas around Carpiquet and hold the high ground. So no, them taking Caen was never an objective.
Paratroopers. During the first wave, 3,000 lion-hearted Canadians rushed towards German pillboxes, taking heavy casualties. They were then followed in by tanks, which obliterated most of the German beach defenses, allowing infantrymen to swarm in and begin close-quarters fighting. Impressively, it took them less than 2 hours to secure their first route off the beach at the small town of Courcelles. By the end of the day, Courcelles-sur-Mer, Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, and Colombier-sur-Soleil had all fallen, and the tank regiment of the 1st Hussars were at the Caen-Bayeux highway intersection, making them the only Allied unit on D-Day to actually reach their final objective.
So, 1st Hussars is a London, Ontario unit, still is to this day. I'm a Londoner by birth, my hometown, so I do a lot of them. I got their history here next to me somewhere. They reach their objective, which is Bretteville-Augeuse, which comes up again later in the fighting in Normandy. However, again, it's presented a lot saying, the Canadians reach the furthest, which is technically true in a lot of cases. It's again disputed, like most things are when it comes to warfare. However, this is kind of overblown, in my opinion. It's a recce element of the 1st Hussars that reach their objective. They don't stay there because they know they can't hold it without infantry because they're literally on their own into the town itself. So they reach the town, but they pretty much immediately come right back to the rest of the regiment and harbor with them overnight. So they don't hold the objective by any means. I mean, it's impressive they're able to get there, but it's not kind of a bit of an overblown statement about them getting as far as they did.
The Devil's Brigade.
This is a big one.
In World War II, the Canadians distinguished themselves not only as dependable infantrymen, but also as skilled commandos in a joint American-Canadian unit called the 1st Special Service Force, that are known as the Devil's Brigade, or the Black Devils. How they got that nickname there. The Devil's Brigade was formed in June 1942 and had only accepted individuals into its ranks who were already well acquainted with survival and the outdoors. As a result, former skiers, parachutists, hunters, lumberjacks, trappers, and game wardens made up the majority of its personnel. These hard and rugged men were transformed into killing machines via a brutal training regime that involved 100-mile speed marches and specialist training with all sorts of weapons, explosives, and vehicles. To strike fear into their enemies' hearts on the battlefield, they placed a calling card on the dead, emblazoned with the phrase, "The worst is yet to come," in German. The Black Devils were assigned the most dangerous assignments, with one of their most...
So that happens at Anzio because that's their first real way of doing that, right? It was an attritional fight. I argue that they should never have been sent to Anzio to be used as basically line infantry, holding that perimeter. That was not what they were trained to do. It was seemingly a waste of resources to do so. That's also where they gained the name the Black Devils, because there's a supposed German diary, which we don't know where the original is, that's captured. Some think it's the intelligence officers of the unit making it up to kind of rally the troops and to get them, to fulfill this sort of reputation of being bloodthirsty. But I talk about that in the video about Anzio that I'll link down below.
Iconic missions taking place in December of 1943 at the mountain peak of Monte la Defensa, southeast of Rome.
This is their first big
For
one.
about a month, multiple British, Canadian, and American assaults attempting to dislodge the Germans at the top had been wiped out one after the other. By the time the Devil's Brigade arrived on the scene, Monte la Defensa had been battered with over 200,000 shells, earning it the nickname the $1 Million Hill. At 1:30 a.m. on December 3rd, carrying 60-pound rucksacks as well as knives, guns, and bayonets, and with charcoal blackened faces, 600 men of the 1st Special Service Force began climbing up the near vertical cliff face as fog and swirling snow enveloped the mountain. A little before 6 a.m., they reached the summit and began quietly slitting the throats of sentries. Then, all of a sudden, a rock slide gave away their position and the enemy opened fire. The fighting was intense and both sides suffered heavy losses, but the battle-hardened Germans were eventually expelled. In a mere 2 hours, the month-long standoff had been ended by a force that was 10 times smaller than the combined Allied force that had up until then failed to take Monte la Defensa. With a little help from the Americans, they had shown that once again, that to mess with a Canadian in wartime is to sign your own death warrant.
Okay, other than that little dramatic line there, ending it, a little help from the Americans is not accurate. The 1st Special Service Force was an American initiative, American commander the entire time, a Canadian second in command. But it was an American effort in a lot of ways. It's American kit, American idea, part of the American command. Canadians had separate command technically, but the units are integrated with Canadians and Americans. There was no differentiation. Your squad can be a mix of both. They weren't separated by nationality by any means. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to say a little bit of help from the Americans, because the unit was always majority American troops. It was sort of close to 50-50. It obviously changed depending on casualties and things like that, but it was always more Americans than it was Canadians. So an interesting little video there. Quite a good stuff in there. I like it. I like the animation that's able to bring these stories in. Of course, their name is Simple History, so that's what they're going for. Just a few things in there I think are a bit disingenuous or kind of bending the truth a little bit. But some of them are bang on. That 3rd Battalion thing is bang on. It's recorded by the battalion itself. So that's always good to see that there is this supporting documentation for things like that. So a very interesting video, obviously playing into the stereotypes a little bit of, polite Canadians. The moose thing was interesting. But, also another stereotype that the Canadians are particularly brutal in war and carry all these supposed war crimes. And I hear all the time that they're the reason for the Geneva Conventions around POWs and things like that. And it's not really the case. There's no real evidence supporting that. Canada makes a splash on the world stage in some places, but nothing that big. The big powers are not really listening to Canada when it comes to anything or doing things because of Canada, especially after the First World War. It's just not the case. But interesting video. I'll link it down below. Also, I have videos talking about majority of these things talked in here, so check those out if you haven't seen them before. And just want a quick shout out to my patrons and YouTube channel members. Thank you for all the help you give in running this channel. Wouldn't happen without you. So thanks again, everybody.